I freaking love Green Snake, and for the longest time I couldn't put my finger on why. So I decided to do an in-depth breakdown of the film so I could figure out why it resonated with me so much. First off, let me warn you, there will be major spoilers up ahead, so if you haven't seen the movie, drop everything and go watch it. It is so worth it. Secondly, it was some time ago that I discovered the heroine's journey formula, and ever since then I have been dying to talk about it. So that is absolutely something I will be touching on in this video. Though keep in mind that Green Snake doesn't follow the formula perfectly. And thirdly, at the time I discovered this movie, I had no idea that it was a sequel. And after watching its predecessor Whitesnake, I was deeply disappointed. So I'll be getting into that here as well. Extra note, I'll be treating Green Snake as a standalone since its predecessor actually has very little impact on it. So without further ado, let's get into it. Right off the bat, we are thrown straight into the thick of things. So the movie has a very limited amount of time to establish its characters and get us to care. We start off with the two sisters, Verta and Blanca, attacking the Jinshan temple. And the narrative effectively tells us who to root for in these first character interactions. Verta doesn't want to get dragged into Blanca's fight, but she comes around after a brief moment, choosing to stand by her sister and showing that she can be reasonable. On the other hand, Fa Hai, our villain, even after easily besting the two sisters, presses his attack, and ultimately condemns Blanca to be separated from her sister, husband, and child for eternity, despite his underling, Blanca's husband, begging him for mercy. All this establishes Fa Hai to be deeply unreasonable, and serves to highlight the goodness in Blanca's character, as she decides to take all the blame for these events on herself. Afterward, to further hammer home Fa Hai's despicable nature, we learn from Verta of his hypocrisy and persecution of the two sisters who had been living in peace. And finally, to twist the knife in deeper, Fa Hai banishes Verta to what is essentially Purgatory, a dystopian city known as Asraville. Now, it's important to note in Verta's rebuke of Fa Hai that she mentions how he is stronger than her and Blanca, and this establishes her misbelief that strength is everything, the ultimate goal, the be-all, end-all, as it were. And she doubles down on this idea by calling Blanca's husband a useless man, and berating him for being unable to protect Blanca. And this, coupled with Verta's decision to fight alongside her sister, shows us her character's core value, that being protecting others. And this is confirmed by later plot points, though we'll touch on those later. For now, let's refer back to the heroine's journey, where we'll see that Verta's separation from Blanca represents her separation from the feminine, since you'll note throughout the film that Blanca, or even just her memory, tends to bring out that softer, more compassionate side of Verta. I have noticed upon rewatching the film that it tends to be more literal with its depiction of femininity and masculinity according to the heroine's journey, choosing to display them outwardly as physically present characters rather than inwardly in our protagonist. Though that element is definitely to be found as well, with strength being the more masculine trait and the desire to protect being the feminine. Though of course the two often end up working in tandem. But continuing on, it's in Asraville that we meet Sun. And if this were a typical hero's journey, Sun would be the closest thing we have to a mentor figure. So of course she gets axed off. But before then, Verta, who has been robbed of her magic, leans hard into her misbelief that strength is everything, training herself tirelessly so that she can survive this harsh world and perhaps reunite with her sister. But true to the heroine's journey, her success proves temporary when Sun is killed, though mercifully she is able to find new allies in the wake of her loss. As a note, meeting Simon further fuels her misbelief. Through witnessing the way others respect his strength, coupled with the fact that he is able to protect her, she sees herself as proven right about her misgivings toward her sister's choice in partner. I do have additional thoughts on Verta's relationship with Simon, but I'll circle back around to them. For now, let me pump the brakes a quick second so I can gush about Bao Qing. My god, does this woman have an entrance. She absolutely steals the show every time she's on screen. And part of what makes her so fascinating is that she is very nearly a complete mystery. All we learn about her is that she alone came of her own accord to Asraville, and is looking to use people's obsessions to fuel her workshop in the human world. Aside from that, she is a total enigma. The first time I saw her take on her demon form, I was absolutely awestruck. The playfulness in her voice, her flashy design, the gracefulness in the way she moves, and the sense of how she's just above it all, almost like a force of nature, untouchable and unpredictable, makes her hands down the most riveting character in this movie. Now, there's an interesting moment by the pool of release where Bao Qing asserts that attachment is suffering. Attachment here is represented by the character's obsessions, which is a bit of a questionable choice since attachment and obsession are two very different things which should not be conflated, but I'm willing to let it slide this once. So when viewing memories of her sister in the pool, Verta recalls a moment of Blanca speaking about her husband, saying that she'll continue searching for him even if he doesn't remember her simply because she remembers him. And this is an important line, so hang on to that for now and I'll come back to it later. But continuing on, Verta isn't exactly pleased with these recollections and screams, and I couldn't help but wonder, especially in light of Bao Qing's previous comments, if she was speaking to herself as well as Blanca. Later on, Verta witnesses the masked man trying to protect others despite his own weakness, and it sparks more memories of her sister, compelling her to look out for him. This ends up putting her at odds with Simon, who sees the masked man as a burden, leading to him abandoning Verta and her newfound friend to the mercy of Asraville's evil spirits. This effectively yanks the rug out from under Verta's feet, forcing her to see how her own belief that strength is everything was in fact a lie. And she's so dismayed by this betrayal that she considers letting the spirits destroy her. But the masked man calls her back from the brink, revealing his face as the face of her sister. So it's here that we have the secondary failing of the masculine and the initiation and descent to the goddess. The goddess being representative of all the positive traits of femininity that our heroine has left behind, or in this case, the feminine embodied through the memory of Blanca. So while Simon in this moment symbolizes the masculine, the nameless man bearing Blanca's face symbolizes the goddess. And in the wake of this revelation, Verta pours her heart out, putting into words her realization that a true heart is of greater importance than physical strength. As a side note, I do think it's a shame that this movie tends to over-explain and repeat itself at certain points, but I'd consider that its only major weakness. Continuing on, after returning to consult Bao Qing on how to escape Asraville, Verta is willing to completely abandon her strength, thus showing her yearning to reconnect with the feminine. But a wrench gets thrown into her plan to leave with Blanca's look-alike when the Ox and his horde show up, revealing the masked man as a spy and a fraud. Worse still, there are signs later confirmed that the Ox is actually a pawn of Fa Hai's, though it takes a heroic sacrifice from Simon to acquire this information. Lastly, when the masked man is offered the opportunity to choose a final form and join the beast ranks, he shockingly makes the decision to don Blanca's face once more, betraying the expectations of his master and his horde. And when Bao Qing summons a flood immediately afterward, the masked man works to save Verta from the imminent threat, even though she is disposed against him. Afterward, Verta again concludes that strength isn't all important, but on the other hand, even the weak can lack a true heart. So she reconciles with her masculine trait, insisting that from there on out she can only rely on herself. Though I think this statement is not so much a resolution as it is a warning to the masked man, since their later interactions show that Verta is willing to rely on him, provided he demonstrate that true heart of his, which he goes above and beyond to do. So now, having learned from Bao Qing an alternate method of leaving Asraville, Verta is faced with a daunting trial, one that will take every ounce of strength and willpower she possesses to overcome. The Spider Goblin tells her to look after herself, but it's largely thanks to the masked man staying by her side and silently supporting her that she's able to conjure the resolve needed to conquer her trial. Cue the most badass montage ever where Verta fights Fa Hai for 20 years, growing stronger and stronger until finally she beats him. And this payoff is so damn satisfying. And as an interesting side note, Fa Hai's opening speech about how he was helping people through enabling the Ox to freely murder the inhabitants of Asraville shows his twisted view of the feminine, and how he uses the masculine to carry out this perverted application. Finally, Verta and the masked man are faced with their last obstacle, a mad rush to cross the Wish Bridge and leave Asraville, even as the Ox and the city's deadly spirits chase them down. And it's important to note here that both the Ox and Blanca's lookalike face a similar fate for very similar reasons. Because the Ox only ever relied on the masculine, strength at the cost of others, while the masked man relied solely on the feminine, protection and defense at the cost of himself, they both end up transformed into spirits and erased from existence, ultimately showing that there has to be balance. In his final moments, the Ox begs for someone to protect him, even as he actively sabotages Verta and the masked man. On the other hand, the masked man willingly sacrifices himself so that Verta can return to the human world, and is quick to make peace with the consequences, solidifying the fact that yes, Verta can still rely on others, despite the painful losses and betrayals she suffered. Which brings me back to Bao Qing's earlier comment. Ultimately, she's right. Attachment is suffering. But that's not all it is. It's also joy, comfort, and warmth. Verta having to watch the masked man throw away his life to save her, only to recognize later on that he was, in fact, Blanca's reincarnation, is devastating. But it's because of their shared trials in Asraville that a piece of Blanca's soul was able to survive in the object of her obsession and return to the human world, allowing the sisters to be reunited. And a nice little touch I noticed upon my third viewing of this film is how cherry blossoms, which are reminiscent of Blanca, appear throughout the movie. They're there in the beginning, of course, then we see them again during Verta's trial, which helps compel her to keep fighting, and then lastly we see them surrounding the Wish Bridge and the portal where the masked man sacrifices himself, showing that Blanca was with Verta the entire time. So now it's finally time for me to share my thoughts on Verta's relationship with Simon, since it has some pretty interesting connotations regarding the movie as a whole. Verta has a pretty rocky relationship with men. She deeply disapproves of Blanca's husband, despises Fa Hai, and is betrayed by Simon and the masked man, even if they do both manage to redeem themselves by the end. Which makes it deeply interesting how Blanca was reincarnated as a man, and as a man essentially acts as Verta's salvation. But backtracking to her time with Simon, in contrast to how she is almost always the one doing the protecting, specifically from men, Verta is suddenly being protected by a man, and she's okay with that. Enjoys it even, which resonates so deeply with me as a bisexual woman, because the desire to protect and be protected can be so rewarding and so conflicting at the same time. If you've ever seen the anime Revolutionary Girl Utena or even My Next Life as a Villainess, these shows capture the feeling quite well, especially Revolutionary Girl Utena. That show honestly has so many layers. If you watch deep dives into it, there is so much for your brain to chew on. But getting back on track, if you recall this scene,
无论他是何模样，无论他还记不记得我，我都要找到他，因为我记得。
The reason why that was important was because from the moment Verta arrived in Asureville, the reincarnation of Blanca was unconsciously applying that same logic to Verta, even though he couldn't remember exactly who she was. As a final note, and I swear this is the last tangent before getting into Whitesnake, but I really wanted to point out how the animators, in order to show Verta's nature as a demon snake, actually have her move like a snake. It's such a cool detail and I love it so much. Okay, now for Whitesnake. Originally, I intended not to revisit this film and instead summarize my complaints based on memory, but I wanted to be absolutely sure that I was representing the movie fairly, and so I ended up suffering through a second viewing for that very purpose. And somehow it was worse than I remembered. To sum it up in a single word, Whitesnake is horribly cliche. The amnesia plotline has been done a million times, and so has the Romeo/Juliet forbidden romance type love story, especially with the monster twist. The meet-cute talking animal and magical flying umbrella make me feel like I'm watching a Disney film, which creates such an unbefitting tone for the story. I mean, they even have a musical number. The movie does have a few saving graces, but they are incredibly scarce. Bao Qing, thankfully, is still captivating every second of screen time she has. And Verta and Blanca's relationship remains solid, with Verta going so far as to stake her own life on how much she trusts Blanca. Unfortunately, this positive aspect doesn't last long, since ultimately Verta is painted as the overbearing sister, shallow and unreasonable, and intent on stamping out the flames of her sister's love life. She's almost unrecognizable from how she was portrayed in the sequel, which was a major turnoff for me. But continuing on, the movie barrels on ahead with its generic and predictable plot points. The main character has to rescue his village, cue overdramatic monster fight, and then the totally not evil looking snake lady pulls a "I'm suddenly power hungry" move and steals all the souls of her own army. But beyond predictability, there are just so many problems with this ending. Verta's death scales are conveniently removed and forgotten all of 2 seconds later, as if the story last minute remembered that was still a thing it had to deal with and just wanted to move on as quickly as possible. And speaking of remembering things last minute, the animal sidekick is finally given something to do in the last few minutes of the film, while the rest of the time he just existed to annoy the audience. Oh, and to have his tail stolen by Bao Qing so Blanca's love interest could become a demon. And in the climax of the movie, Verta literally had her soul stolen, but somehow she's just a-okay later with zero explanation. In retrospect, if I had seen Whitesnake first, I probably never would have even considered watching its sequel, which would have been such a shame because I never would have known what I was missing out on. But it truly boggles my mind how the creators of such an unimaginative film could have gone on to create something as incredible as Green Snake. My best guess is that they recognized their mistakes and endeavored to create the best follow-up they could. And if that was the case, then it's safe to say they succeeded spectacularly. As a final note, I find it interesting how the creators pivoted from a simple romance to a compelling story centered on familial love, since that change is curiously reflective of the trend happening over the last decade or so, where leaders among the entertainment industry have been slightly shifting their focus to familial bonds, especially those between sisters, which have been showing to be smash hits in some cases, which is hugely refreshing to see since we were long overdue for moving away from the surprisingly widespread assumption that romantic love is the ultimate love. But speaking of sisterly bonds, if you want to read my tale of two sisters set in the Star Wars universe, you can find it linked in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed, be sure to give this video a like, share it with your friends, leave a comment to let me know your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. And if you're looking for more ways to show your support, consider becoming a patron, link in the description. Of course, to those of you who are already a patron, massive thanks for your contributions. Don't forget to stay loud and proud, folks. I'm your alibi, and I will see you next time. And as an interesting side okay, side okay.